I will introduce her in English just to show that I too can speak English with either horrible or charming French accent. So the next speaker is Professor Patricia Galvao Teles. You have already heard her this morning, and you could appreciate her talent on a topic which is tightly linked with that dealt with by Jean-Marc Touvenin, but which is more specific. In a way, we continue our funnel presentation from the most general with Maurice Camteau to the most specific, since Patricia will deal with the protection of people affected by the sea level. It's not only a threat, I suppose, it has already become a reality. It is indeed a very timely topic, not unrelated to one of the issues which is currently addressed by the ILC, of which Patricia has been a member since 2017. Patricia was trained at the Law Faculty of Lisbon and the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva before joining the Autonomous University in Lisbon. And she also teaches as guest professor of the Nova University. And she too is both a scholar and an international law practitioner, in particular as being, besides many other functions, if you look at her CV, it's quite impressive. Being since 2015 the senior legal consultant on international law at the legal department of the Portuguese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she also is a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Patricia, tienes la palabra y supongo la tomarás en español. Only 10 minutes.
No, I'm speaking in English.
English? Good. With
Portuguese accent. French accent. Alors, merci beaucoup Alain pour les mots très gentils, mais aussi merci à l'Institut pour d'organiser ce panel. Moi, je suis certainement la membre la plus récente, je ne dirais pas la plus jeune, mais la plus récente de l'Institut. Et c'est aussi avec un grand plaisir que je participe à cette panel organisé par l'Institut sur le thème de la migration. Mais je ne parle pas du travail de l'Institut, je parle du travail que je fais couramment à la Commission de droit international. Vous avez déjà écouté mes collègues, aussi coprésidents du groupe de travail sur l'étude qu'on fait sur la montée du niveau de la mer. Mais comme j'ai dit, je ne parlerai pas en français, ni en anglais, ni en espagnol, mais en anglais. So, I wanted just to also put this in the context, which I think it's an important context of our meeting today. I mean, this topic of protection of persons affected by sea level rise, my task is made easier certainly because of the presentation that was made by Professor Camteau and just now by Professor Touvenin, because we're really, looking into a more strict, more narrow approach on protection of persons affected by one of the most perhaps visible so far, and one with impacts that might be irreversible, and so they're special in that effects from climate change. But what is very interesting, and you might recognize this image which really, made Time magazine cover already in 2019, and I think a lot has happened since then. It has really put the issue of sea level rise on the center of the map of the discussions of climate change because of its impacts that are already being felt, and as I was mentioning, irreversible impacts if you connect it also with what my colleague Juan José Ruda Santolaria was saying today of the possible disappearance of certain states, and also the issue affecting the law of the sea aspects. But one of the very interesting aspects is also that the science is very clear. The science is very clear with respect to the impacts of climate change, and in particular with respect to the impacts of sea level rise with regard to the effects on people. And I normally call this subtopic of protection of persons the human face of sea level rise. So that connects very well also with what Jean-Marc said. It's, of course, difficult sometimes to say exactly why people move, but the science is showing us that in small island developing states, but also in low-lying coastal areas, and that includes Vietnam, it includes Miami, includes Bangladesh, not necessarily just the small island developing states. And this has led really the interested, affected states to wanting more legal clarity on the issue of what happens not only to their maritime zones, the state, if the state disappears, but also to people. And we see that in most cases, we are talking about populations where states are very vulnerable and with difficulties to respond. So one of the interesting and one aspect that I wanted to highlight is that not only the ILC has already worked a bit on the issue of disasters, and of course sea level rise has been considered as one disaster, and that has put together a number of principles with regard to especially international cooperation, not so much the protection of persons part, but international cooperation, the duties of the affected state, the duties of the international community in terms of other states and international organizations. But this has been something that also the International Law Association has worked on, and that's a point that I wanted to emphasize in the spirit of our meeting today, you know, how we can have really important synergies between the works of national societies and ILA and also the Institute, because the resolution on mass migration is also extremely relevant to the work that we're doing in the Commission. But the work that has been doing by the International Law Association, that has had a committee since a few years ago, so before the ILC has taken up the work, and I'm also a member of that committee, it has really created an important synergy. So many of the national societies are also national branches of the ILA, and we have many colleagues from different national branches in the ILA committee, and because I think that's the advantage of the Institute and the advantage of the ILA also, that there's more liberty, you know, in putting forward more progressive proposals than we have in the ILC, where we work more in terms of, you know, state practice and trying to codify the state practice, which certainly in this area is still quite sparse. But we're building on the important work with a lot of synergy with the International Law Association, and so it's something to keep in mind, you know, the possibility of synergies between the topics and inputs of the Institute and also of the International Law Association. So I'm looking specifically at the issues in terms of legal terms, in terms of protection of persons, the human rights side that Jean-Marc has also mentioned. To what extent the duty of international cooperation plays also a role in this part? What would be the principles that states have to take into account when they want to protect their populations? And I think this is an important aspect. I mean, the main desire of the affected populations is not to move, it's to stay in their home places. And, you know, especially in the Pacific, there are strong cultural ties to the territory, and so the principal desire of the affected populations is to remain in situ. But so what would be the principles that states would have to look at when they want to help? But then, of course, you have to look at principles applicable to migration and relocation and internally displaced. So these are the type of questions we're looking at, looking at the different possible applicable legal frameworks. As Jean-Marc said, there's a lot of hard law already, both from human rights, migration law, refugee law, international disaster law, and climate change. So the question here is whether to try to take these principles and try to apply them to this specific issue, or whether we need to develop a more specific legal framework, and the answer is not totally clear yet. This is what we're looking at. Of course, I mean, there's a bit of development in terms of state practice of international organizations. Some international organizations are particularly active, like IOM, UNHCR, the Federation, and some other initiatives like the Platform on Disaster Displacement, that is a follow-up of the Nansen Initiative, but also especially the Pacific Island states, and AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. They have been quite active in trying to feed to this process and sharing their national practice. So I'm going to skip over the Tetiota case that Jean-Marc had already mentioned, but just, I mean, in this photo, you can see that Kiribati is in some areas is only 3 meters above sea level, and the expected mean sea level rise is 1 meter globally, but in some areas it's going to be higher. So in this case, the Human Rights Committee said that for the moment, what Jean-Marc said about, having an impact in terms of the human rights, in terms of the climate change and triggering the non-refoulement obligations, but the committee said not now, in 15 years. And so we're looking at a quite tight time frame that really puts the international community in need to come up with some answers. Of course, climate refugees is a term that doesn't exist, and so this is something that even from a political point of view, we're trying to avoid because it makes confusion in the law. But it's true that there is a number of legal principles that already exist, including the non-refoulement principle, but also the protection of the affected populations in terms of their right to life, protection of the vulnerable groups, protection in terms, for example, of access to information and consultation, important procedural human rights that can be applicable to this. But it's still a fragmented and general legal framework. And at the Commission, we are trying to identify, and these are the list of issues that we're going to continuing studying in order to come up with and this is my sign to finish. We're going to try to come up with some answers in terms of developing, based on existing law and perhaps a bit of development in terms of lex ferenda regarding the existing law, to have at least a more clear understanding of the legal framework that would be applicable. And in the end, but that's going to be a political decision for states, whether we need to develop a more specific framework, or we're going to work on with the principles that we have with international law at the moment. So I stop here, and I hope that we can have a discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
You too, Patricia, are an excellent pupil. You respected your time perfectly. I think that, well, first I would say that 15 years is tomorrow, and I think we should be, what you said is not really réconfortant, is not really nice to hear, in a way. To hear it's okay, but to realize is rather terrible. The other thing which struck me is something you said at the beginning. You said, I will not speak of the Institute, fine, but I will speak of the ILC. And you said in the Institute, or ILA, we have more freedom. I have been a member of the ILC for 22 years, and I felt that I had a lot of freedom, and that there is a problem of how influential you are. Are you more influential in the Institute, or are you more influential in the ILC? I read the issue and let you answer. Let each of you answer.